The day I chose not to get up, sickness had nothing to do with it. My limbs were completely intact, and I was not assisting a neighbor through childbirth, which is a duty that frequently calls me away. There are plenty of nights when I am summoned well ahead of the dawn, tramping through freezing slush toward a dark homestead where a frightened mother clings to her spouse's hand, fighting back her cries. Had that been the case, my absence from the kitchen would have been entirely acceptable and expected. Instead, I remained beneath the blankets for the simple reason that an overwhelming exhaustion had settled deep into my spirit. It was a profound, heavy weariness that takes root deep in your joints and behind your eyes, momentarily making you feel as though your physical frame has been loaned out to someone who has driven it into the ground for far too long. I lingered there because, in that hazy, silent instant right before consciousness fully took hold, the weight of my daily obligations and the expectations of everyone counting on me briefly slipped my mind. When reality rushed back, I chose to stay put anyway. It was only for perhaps 4 or 5 minutes, but the reaction it caused made it seem as though I had committed an act of arson against our own property. I have shared a life and a marriage with Eli for nearly 2 decades now, and together we have raised 6 children, with 2 already establishing their own households and 4 still remaining under our roof. The land we cultivate exacts a grueling toll on a person's body, far more than anyone might expect when considering the quiet dignity of an agricultural life. Alongside the farm, my calling as a midwife began when I was just 19, at the moment Miriam Stoltz gripped my hand during a complicated labor and refused to let go. Her mother remarked afterward that I possessed a natural calling, prompting me to apprentice under Edna, the community's elder midwife, who possessed massive, capable hands and a profound reserve of patience that I have spent my entire life trying to replicate. I share these details to illustrate my character. I am simply not the type of person who idles in bed while the world wakes up. Never in my adult life have I permitted myself to lie awake after the sun begins to hint at the horizon, a habit instilled long before marriage when the realities of a dairy farm dictate your schedule regardless of your personal desires. My life is defined by movement, rekindling the embers, preparing the morning meal, rousing the household, and keeping everything in motion. Therefore, my decision to remain still that one morning should not be interpreted as a sudden lapse in character, a moral failure, or a symptom of some deep internal breakdown. It represented a single, isolated moment across 19 years of unyielding routine. The preceding days had been exceptionally demanding, and while I have no desire to exaggerate the hardship, it was undeniably grueling. 2 separate deliveries had required my presence, one of which became highly complicated and stranded me at the Yoder homestead for 11 exhausting hours. I spent the vast majority of that time on my feet, offering up desperate, intense prayers that felt less like a formal conversation with God and more like a fierce plea for intervention. Ultimately, the infant arrived safely, and both mother and child survived the ordeal, leaving me to trek back home through the pitch-black pre-dawn hours alone, since Eli had no way of knowing when to expect me. That particular birth lingered in my thoughts long after it ended. The infant had been improperly positioned, requiring 3 intense hours of physical guidance, shifting the mother into various postures to gently coax the baby around, the kind of silent, intuitive labor that defines midwifery and remains nearly impossible to describe to an outsider. An unusual state of mind takes over during a perilous delivery, hovering somewhere between profound prayer and absolute mechanical focus. Your awareness becomes razor-sharp and entirely serene, yet beneath that calm exterior, a psychological tension is wound tight like a metal cable. Only when the infant draws its first breath, the mother weeps with sheer gratitude, and the father hovers in the entryway clutching his hat, as if witnessing the creation of a new world, which he is, can you finally pack your instruments. As you walk home, that tightly wound internal cable begins to slowly loosen, a process that cannot be rushed or resolved by a single night of sleep. By the time Saturday arrived, the exhaustion had only compounded, as I spent the day assisting Mama Troyer, a title everyone in the community uses for her, with putting up 47 quarts of preserved tomatoes. Her daughter-in-law was sidelined with a badly sprained wrist, leaving her unable to handle the heavy lifting required for canning. Managing that many jars is an immense physical burden, and by nightfall, the strain in my spine and the ache in my hands made themselves known the moment the lanterns were extinguished. Decades of preserving food mean my muscles move on instinct, but every physical body encounters a breaking point, and mine arrived somewhere around the 41st jar. Mama Troyer provided an evening meal as a token of gratitude, chatting incessantly through the dinner, which was intended as kindness and accepted as such, even though a part of me would have traded anything for a single hour of absolute silence. When Sunday arrived, it brought the weekly gathering, which has never served as a time of relaxation for me. While I recognize that some women find solace in sitting quietly without any immediate chores, my own experience is dictated by the constant vigilance required to keep the children behaving appropriately in front of the entire congregation. Jonas was dealing with a severe cold, meaning my energy was entirely consumed by ensuring he didn't disrupt the service or bring embarrassment upon the family. We managed to survive the day, leading directly into Monday's grueling laundry routine, an obligation that alters for nothing and no one. My daughter Leah provided assistance, displaying a commendable work ethic when she chooses to focus, and her diligence that day allowed us to finish by the afternoon, which counts as a successful start to the week. On Tuesday, I baked the household's bread supply and joined my two eldest boys out in the elements to repair a boundary line where a post had completely deteriorated, much to the vocal disapproval of the livestock. While the baking is second nature to me, the fence repair required 2 hours of manual labor with a heavy digger in freezing mud that couldn't decide whether to solidify. So when Wednesday morning arrived, I simply lay there for 4 minutes, listening to the early bird calls outside the glass. Eli had already risen, which I could tell by the subtle shift in the house's atmosphere, that distinct emptiness that lingers in a room right after someone has vacated it. He had already drifted down to the kitchen, leaving behind the faint scent of a newly stoked fire, while Leah's deliberate movements could be heard near the stove. I remained motionless, staring blankly at the ceiling boards, completely emptying my mind of all thoughts. I merely listened to the wildlife until the distinct sound of his boots echoed on the stairs. I could identify Eli's stride anywhere, even among a crowd of men. It carries a heavy heel strike and a deliberate cadence that is neither hurried nor hesitant, signaling that his mind is entirely made up before he even arrives at his destination. Over 19 years, I have learned to decode every variation of that walk. The rhythm that indicates he is ready for sleep, the pace that signals trouble with the livestock, and the specific cadence that means he has rehearsed a speech in his mind. On this particular morning, it was the stride of a man who had reached a firm conclusion. He pushed the door open without knocking. It is his private space as much as mine, so ceremony is unnecessary, and took up a position at the foot of our bed to observe me. I remained flat on my back, the blankets pulled tight, staring upward, completely conscious, entirely healthy, but utterly motionless. He broke the silence by simply saying my name, but the way he speaks it can carry the weight of an entire sermon. When I responded that I was on my way, he countered by pointing out that I was still under the covers. At that, I forced myself to sit up, refusing to conduct such an exchange from a prone position. There is a certain dignity required in these moments, even when you are fully aware that you lack a solid defense. Pushing my hair out of my face, I looked at my husband. Eli is a commanding figure, possessing the dense, unyielding strength that a lifetime of physical labor carves into a man, where every muscle serves a practical purpose without an ounce of vanity. He was already wearing his heavy work coat, indicating he had completed a portion of the outdoor responsibilities by himself, which triggered my first real wave of remorse. I still don't believe those 4 minutes of rest justified the severity of what followed, but leaving him to handle the chores alone was a legitimate failing on my part. When I defended myself by saying I was just resting and that Leah was already tending to the hearth, he reminded me of her youth. I argued that at 16 she was perfectly capable of managing the fire, but he maintained his characteristically low, even tone. Those who do not know my husband well often mistake his quiet nature for simple gentleness. In many respects, he is a gentleman. He treats the animals with care, and he sat silently with me in the darkness when we endured a miscarriage between the births of Ruth and Jonas, offering presents instead of the hollow explanations other men lean on. Yet, a quiet demeanor should never be confused with a soft disposition, and that morning his quietness carried a sharp edge. He calmly explained that a wife's place is to rise alongside her husband, arguing that the early hours belong to the collective family unit and that my choice to stay in bed forced everyone else to compensate for my absence. He insisted that our daughter should not be burdened with responsibilities that rightfully belonged to me, delivering these points with the exact same instructional tone he uses when teaching our sons a farm task. It wasn't explicitly cruel, nor did he exhibit any concern for how heavily his words landed. To be entirely accurate, he never leveled accusations of laziness or selfishness. He simply stated the undeniable reality that I was resting while the household required my labor, a situation that disrupted the order he maintains. Eli possesses a rigid set of expectations that can feel like a dependable fortress or a suffocating garment, depending on your emotional state. That morning, it felt entirely suffocating. Yet looking back across the years, I recognize that his unyielding nature provides a stability worth appreciating, even when you chafe against its boundaries. Perched on the mattress edge, I chose to listen without offering a counterargument, a lesson hard-earned over nearly 2 decades of marriage. A woman must discern which disagreements are worth pursuing and which ones are decided before they even begin. His core argument wasn't fundamentally flawed, even if the gravity he assigned to those few minutes felt entirely disproportionate. I had chosen to stay in bed, the family had adapted, and no crisis had occurred, yet the central fact remained that I had neglected my routine. Furthermore, the rational part of my mind, the part that had been awake before him listening to the birds, acknowledged his point regarding our daughter. Leah possesses immense capability, far more than she realizes or than I typically allow her to demonstrate, but at 16, the functionality of the home should not rest on her shoulders before I have even made an appearance downstairs. That was a valid criticism, and I could admit it to myself. When he finished speaking, I simply acknowledged his words, to which he gave a brief nod before returning to the ground floor. Assuming the matter was settled, I dressed quickly and went downstairs to relieve Leah at the stove. She handed over the cooking utensils with the unmistakable, tight-lipped expression of a teenager trying desperately to mask her own opinions on the domestic drama. I completed the breakfast preparations, arranged the place settings, and watched as Eli and the younger boys came inside, tracking mud from the barn. We bowed our heads for grace, ate our meal, and navigated the morning without a single mention of the bedroom confrontation. I believed the incident was behind us, but I was mistaken. What followed was a quiet, systematic adjustment on Eli's part, one that was profoundly effective in its execution. He didn't resort to dramatic reprimands or alter the mechanics of my daily workload. Instead, he implemented a far more subtle strategy that reflected his true character. Historically, we had always risen independently, usually within 15 minutes of each other, which allowed the household to function smoothly. Following that Wednesday, however, Eli made it his personal policy to wake me the exact moment he got out of bed. He would simply vocalize my name, creating an immediate expectation of movement without needing to engage in any further discussion. The shift was never formally announced, it simply became our new reality. The first time he did it, I dismissed it as a random occurrence, but by the second morning, his intention became clear. By the 4th consecutive day, I understood completely that this was the permanent resolution he had formulated during his deliberate walk up the stairs that Wednesday morning. He had concluded that I required an external discipline that I was apparently incapable of maintaining on my own. Initially, I experienced this new routine as a form of constant surveillance, which is the most accurate description I can offer. It brought an unsettling sensation of being monitored, as though I could no longer be trusted to fulfill a role I had successfully managed for nearly 20 years without a single hitch. I am a mature woman who has brought over 100 new lives into this world and steered our household through severe crises, including a winter 3 years ago, when Eli suffered from a terrifying respiratory illness that the local physician couldn't quite diagnose. I handled that entire ordeal, along with countless other trials he remains entirely oblivious to, because quiet management is my fundamental purpose. To be shaken awake like a schoolchild prone to oversleeping was deeply frustrating, and I will not pretend otherwise. Yet, to be completely truthful, a trait I prize above all else, because family histories are useless if they are sanitized, my anger was only part of the equation. Deep down, I was forced to admit that my profound exhaustion hadn't materialized out of thin air. It was the direct consequence of a lifelong behavioral pattern. My habit of absorbing the immediate burden in front of me, followed instantly by the next and the next, without ever allowing myself to call a halt. I never voiced a need for a break because doing so felt like an admission of inadequacy, or like demanding a privilege I hadn't earned, or like creating a void that would inevitably crush someone with less endurance than myself. Eli understands this flaw in my nature, perhaps better than I do. He has watched me labor far past my physical limits for long enough to recognize when I have crossed a dangerous threshold, even when I am blind to it. I cannot pinpoint exactly when he began tracking this tendency. It was never a topic of open debate, but somewhere in the middle of our marriage, perhaps after our fourth child, or during that devastating season when the crops failed alongside my mother's declining health, he began observing me closely. His intervention was neither gentle nor explicitly explained, but it targeted the actual root of the issue. He didn't offer soft words of comfort or tell me to rest. Instead, he declared that we would rise as a unit. Within that shared expectation lay a profound sense of security. When he rouses me now, I no longer face the dawn in isolation. The early hours are a collaborative effort, meaning the immense weight of keeping this farm alive is no longer a burden I shoulder entirely by myself in the pitch black. It is a reality we step into simultaneously, standing shoulder to shoulder, which honors the core covenant of our marriage, a responsibility I realize I had been quietly carrying alone long before that single Wednesday lapse. I cannot say for certain if he conceptualized his actions in such emotional terms, as he is not a man who articulates his motivations that way, but nearly 2 decades of partnership have allowed me to translate his true meaning. This morning routine remains our standard to this day. I will not pretend that I greet his wake-up call with profound appreciation every single morning. There are still plenty of days when I would trade a great deal for just 4 more minutes of quiet contemplation beneath the blankets. Nevertheless, I rise, he is there beside me, and we navigate the early darkness as a team, bringing the homestead to life together. It provided a form of support I didn't realize my spirit was craving. This past spring, I was attending a delivery for a young woman welcoming her firstborn, paralyzed by the intense terror that frequently grips new mothers facing the unknown. During a brief lull between her contractions when her mind cleared, she glanced toward the next room where her spouse waited and asked me if the bond of marriage ever becomes less burdensome. I paused to consider her question, deliberately avoiding the standard hollow reassurance that things automatically smooth out over time. I don't believe that common wisdom is accurate or particularly comforting. Instead, I explained to her that the intrinsic difficulty of marriage rarely diminishes. Rather, you simply become fluent in its unique dialect. Every partnership develops its own private vocabulary, comprising the assertions made face to face, the truths hinted at indirectly, and the profound understandings that are never spoken aloud but are manifested through gestures so microscopic that an observer would miss them entirely. Mastering that shared language demands a lifetime of dedication, a process that continues into old age, leaving you to discover new meanings right up until your final breath. She stared at me as if my perspective offered very little comfort, but another intense wave of labor arrived, entirely consuming her attention, which was probably for the best. Yet, I hold firmly to that belief. When I look back on my own life and attempt to summarize that chapter, I think of it as the account of the morning I chose to stay in bed and the unexpected reality that followed. The outcome defied my expectations. I had anticipated a brief reprimand, a period of cold distance, and a swift return to our old status quo. Instead, it produced a subtle, permanent, and unspoken transformation in the very fabric of our daily lives. Eli never offered an apology for his stern words that morning, nor did I expect one, given that his observations were entirely accurate. I had indeed left the family to fend for themselves, a truth I couldn't deny. Conversely, I never apologized for those 4 minutes of stillness, because they were an absolute necessity for my well-being, a fact I believe he recognized. The rigid structure he introduced afterward was, in its own distinct way, an acknowledgement of my limits, a protective framework designed to manage my exhaustion, rather than a demand that I pretend it didn't exist. This is a narrative I have kept close to my chest, as our community does not look kindly on sharing such intimate marital dynamics. It belongs to the private realm of the household, the kind of quiet friction that reshapes a marriage within the confines of a bedroom on a random weekday, remaining entirely hidden from the outside world. Yet, through this medium of expression, I find myself driven to articulate it, to stand witness to the reality of our life together. It is the story of a man with an unmistakable stride who resolves situations long before he reaches them, paired with a woman who possesses the wisdom to identify which conflicts are futile and which ones require her engagement. It is the sum of 19 years, half a dozen offspring, 47 jars of preserved produce, a grueling 11-hour delivery, a broken fence line, and the sound of wildlife outside a window on a chilly dawn. This represents the authentic interior of a lifelong commitment, not an idealized version, but the raw reality of a single Wednesday and every dawn that succeeded it. Just last week, we shared an evening meal entirely alone, a rare occurrence that carries its own quiet significance. The younger children were spending the night at my sister's residence, while Leah was away assisting with a newborn cousin, leaving just Eli and me to sit at the table with a single lantern casting light between us as we ate in near silence. This lack of conversation feels entirely natural to us now, representing a stillness that feels complete rather than vacant. I recognized early on in our union that quietness can possess two entirely different natures, depending on the underlying emotions filling the room. Without breaking his focus from his meal, he remarked that I had carried a look of fatigue all week. My instinctive response was to claim I was fine, a defensive reflex I rely on constantly. He lifted his gaze to meet mine, countering that he knew I was functional, but repeating his observation that I looked tired. His expression made the distinction clear, and I realized he was actively monitoring my well-being, maintaining the same quiet vigilance he has practiced ever since that pivotal Wednesday morning. He wasn't attempting to control me. He was simply keeping watch over a physical limit that my own stubborn nature prevents me from acknowledging. When I admitted that the recent delivery had taken a heavy toll, he gave a slow nod and instructed me to rest the following day. He deliberately avoided telling me to stay in bed, knowing my character well enough to avoid a suggestion I would never accept, which would have felt dishonest. His instruction simply meant we would seek rest earlier in the evening, a quiet acknowledgement that my reserves were depleted and that he was adjusting our routine to compensate. I gave my assent, and we followed through with that plan. As I closed my eyes that evening, I felt a deep sense of being protected and valued, as much as my independent nature allows me to accept. It may not be the full measure of care he wishes to provide, but it is far more than I used to permit myself to feel, and significantly more than I would have known how to accept before spending 19 years bound to this man with his low voice, his purposeful stride, and his unmistakable way of speaking my name when he needs to convey a truth he has no intention of repeating. The morning following my brief rebellion, I rose well before the dawn, long before his boots could reach the stairs or the birds had begun their early songs. I had the hearth roaring and the water heating before a soul had made it down. When Eli finally entered the kitchen space, he caught my eye for a brief instant and remained entirely silent. Words were completely unnecessary. I understood his message perfectly, and he knew I understood it. That unspoken understanding, more than anything else, is the true sound of a 19-year marriage. If this reflection on the hidden sacrifices and silent languages of a lifelong commitment resonates with your own journey, or if you have navigated the complex terrain of partnership and boundaries in your own life, I encourage you to share your experiences and reflections with others who might find comfort in knowing they are not alone in the quiet struggles that shape a home.